The suitcase sat by the door, brown leather, expensive. The kind of luggage that had seen Paris and London and every high-class destination a woman like Sue Ellen Ewing would visit. But this time, it wasn't going anywhere glamorous. It was going to a hotel, maybe an apartment, anywhere that wasn't South Fork. JR stood in the foyer. His drink sat untouched on the hall table. That alone told you something was different. J.R. Ewing always had a drink in his hand, always controlled the glass the way he controlled everything else in his life. But right now, his hands hung at his sides, empty. Sue Ellen came down the stairs. Her heels clicked on the marble. Each step deliberate, final. She wore a cream-colored suit, hair perfect, makeup flawless. She looked like she was going to a business meeting. In a way, she was. The business of ending her marriage. "You don't have to do this," J.R. said. His voice was quiet. That was the first shock. J.R. Ewing didn't do quiet. He commanded. He manipulated. He controlled conversations with volume and presence and sheer force of will. But right now, he sounded almost small. Sue Ellen picked up the suitcase. "We can work this out. We always work it out." She looked at him then. Really looked at him. Not the way she usually did, with contempt or resignation or that particular brand of exhausted anger that came from years of disappointment. This look was different. It was clear, sober, decided. "No," she said. "We don't work it out. You decide what happens and I go along with it, because that's what I've always done." JR's face changed just slightly. A tightening around the eyes, a tension in his jaw. Larry Hagman played it with surgical precision. This was a man watching something slip through his fingers, something he'd always taken for granted. His wife, his possession, his perfectly maintained image of domestic stability. "Where will you go?" he asked. "Does it matter?" "Sue Ellen, don't." She held up a hand. "Don't use that voice, that reasonable voice you use when you're trying to manipulate someone. I've heard it 1,000 times. I've fallen for it 1,000 times. Not today." She walked past him toward the door. He didn't move to stop her. Couldn't. Maybe. Because this was new territory. In all their years of marriage, through all the fights and the drinking and the affairs, Sue Ellen had never actually left. She'd threatened, she'd packed bags, she'd spent nights at hotels, but she'd always come back. This felt different. J.R. knew it. You could see it in the way he stood there, frozen. A man who'd built an empire on knowing exactly what to say and when to say it, suddenly finding himself with no words that would work. "I gave you everything," he said finally. Sue Ellen stopped, her hand on the doorknob. She didn't turn around. "You gave me things," she said. "There's a difference." The door opened. Sunlight poured into the foyer, bright, almost harsh. Sue Ellen stepped into it, and for a moment she was just a silhouette, a woman-shaped absence about to become real. "Sue Ellen," J.R. said. "One last time." His voice cracked on the second syllable. "Just barely. Just enough." She looked back at him over her shoulder. "Goodbye, J.R." The door closed. J.R. stood alone in the foyer. The grandfather clock ticked. The house was silent. Somewhere upstairs, a door closed. Life at South Fork continuing without pause. But down here, something had broken. Something that might not be fixable. He picked up his drink. His hand shook, just slightly, just enough for the ice to rattle against the crystal. He took a long swallow, then another. Then he set the glass down hard enough that it should have shattered. It didn't. This moment, this scene, was years in the making. Sue Ellen Ewing had been a punching bag for so long that viewers had almost stopped noticing. The beautiful wife who drank too much, who had affairs, who made scenes at parties, who embarrassed her husband. That's how she was written. That's how she was perceived. But Linda Gray had always played her with more depth than the scripts gave her. There was intelligence behind those eyes. Pain, yes. Addiction, certainly. But also strength. A woman who'd been broken so many times she'd learned how to break back. The drinking had started early in the marriage, not because Sue Ellen was weak, because she was trapped. Married to a man who saw her as a trophy. a beautiful object to display at fundraisers and business dinners, who expected her to smile and look perfect and never question, never challenge, never be more than decoration. She tried. God, she tried to be the perfect wife, to love him despite everything, to make the marriage work. But JR had affairs, flaunted them, came home smelling like other women and dared her to say something. And when she did, he'd gaslight her, tell her she was imagining things, that she was hysterical, that she was the problem. So she drank. And the drinking gave him more ammunition. Look at her, he'd say. Look at what she's become. An embarrassment, a drunk, unstable. And people believed him. Because J.R. Ewing was powerful and respected, and Sue Ellen was just his troubled wife. But she was more than that. She'd always been more than that. The affair with Dusty had proven it. She'd found someone who saw her as a person, who loved her without conditions, who wanted her happy, not perfect. For a brief moment, she'd tasted what life could be like without JR's thumb pressing down on her. JR had destroyed that too, systematically, ruthlessly. He'd used private investigators and lawyers and every resource at his disposal to make sure Sue Ellen couldn't leave, to make sure she understood that she belonged to him, that she'd always belonged to him. And for a long time, she'd believed it. But something had shifted. Maybe it was the years of therapy. Maybe it was sobriety. Maybe it was just exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness that comes from fighting the same battle over and over with no hope of winning. Or maybe she'd finally realized she didn't need to win. She just needed to leave. The suitcase in the foyer that day represented years of small humiliations, of being called hysterical when she was right, of being told she was crazy when she caught him in lies, of watching him smile at her across the dinner table like nothing was wrong while she died inside. It represented every time he'd chosen Ewing oil over her, every mistress, every broken promise, every moment when she'd begged him to just see her, really see her, and he'd looked right through her. The weight of a marriage that had never been a partnership, only ownership. JR stood in the foyer long after she left. The ice in his drink melted. The sunlight shifted. The house moved around him. Teresa probably came through at some point, saw him standing there, and wisely said nothing. Because this was unfamiliar territory. J.R. Ewing always had a plan, always had an angle, always knew how to turn a loss into a win. But you can't scheme your way out of someone finally having enough. His face in that moment said everything. Larry Hagman's performance was masterful. No dramatics, no yelling, just a man confronting the consequences of his own choices. Maybe for the first time in his life, there was shock there. Genuine shock. Because Sue Ellen had left before, but never like this. Never with that clarity, that finality, that absolute certainty that she was done. There was anger. Of course there was anger. How dare she leave? How dare she make him feel this way? He was J.R. Ewing. People didn't walk away from him. He walked away from them. But underneath the shock and the anger was something else. Something he'd never admit out loud. Fear. Fear that she meant it this time. That she wouldn't come back. That he'd pushed too far and broken something that couldn't be fixed. Fear that he might actually have to face life without her. Not because he loved her, necessarily. J.R. Ewing didn't love the way other people did, but because she was his, part of his identity, part of the image he'd built. J.R. Ewing, successful oilman with the beautiful wife and the perfect family. Without Sue Ellen, who was he? Just a rich man in an empty house. Bobby found him there an hour later, still standing in the foyer, the drink now sitting abandoned on the table. JR staring at the door like if he looked hard enough it would open again and she'd walk back through. She left, J. Puntor said. Not a question, a statement. I know, Bobby replied. She'll be back. She always comes back. Bobby looked at his brother, really looked at him, saw the cracks in the armor, the vulnerability JR would never admit to feeling.
What maybe she won't.
JR's jaw tightened. I don't lose, Bobby. You know that. This isn't a business deal. This is your marriage. Same thing. No, Bobby said quietly. It's not. The silence stretched between them. Brothers who'd spent their whole lives on opposite sides. Bobby, who believed in love and family and doing right. JR, who believed in power and control and winning at any cost. They'd never see eye to eye on this. What did you do? Bobby asked finally. What I always do. That's the problem. JR turned to look at his brother. His face hardened, the vulnerability disappearing behind the mask. I don't need a lecture from you. No, Bobby agreed. You need your wife, but I don't think you know how to have her without owning her. He left JR alone in the foyer, the words hanging in the air like smoke. Sue Ellen checked into a hotel downtown, not the Fairmont or the Adolphus, somewhere smaller, quieter, where reporters wouldn't find her, where JR's people couldn't track her easily. She unpacked the suitcase in a room that was clean and impersonal. Nothing like South Fork. Nothing like the life she'd lived for so many years. It felt like freedom. Her hands shook as she hung up her clothes, not from drinking. She'd been sober for months, but from adrenaline, from the enormity of what she'd just done. She'd walked away from J.R. Ewing, from South Fork, from the only life she'd known as an adult. She sat on the edge of the bed and let herself feel it. The fear, the relief, the grief for what should have been but never was. She loved him once, really loved him. The young oil heir with the charm and the ambition and the promises of a life bigger than she'd ever imagined. He'd delivered on some of those promises. She had money, status, a name that opened doors, but she'd paid for it with pieces of herself. Small sacrifices that added up over the years until she looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. This was her taking herself back. JR didn't come after her that night or the next. He let her sit in that hotel room and wonder if she'd made a mistake, if she could survive without him, if the world outside South Fork would be as cruel as the world inside it. Classic JR strategy. Give someone enough rope to hang themselves. Let them feel the weight of their choices, then swoop in when they're vulnerable and bring them home. But Sue Ellen didn't call, didn't waver. She found an apartment, filed papers with a lawyer, started building a life that didn't revolve around being Mrs. J.R. Ewing. And J.R. felt it, the absence, the empty chair at dinner, the bedroom down the hall that stayed dark, the parties where people asked about Sue Ellen and he had to explain she was visiting family or feeling under the weather or any of the dozen lies that covered the truth. She'd left him. His face at those parties said everything. The tight smile, the quick change of subject, the way his eyes would scan the room like he was looking for someone who wasn't there. Larry Hagman played it perfectly, a man maintaining appearances while crumbling inside. Because this wasn't like a business deal gone bad. He couldn't buy his way out, couldn't scheme or manipulate or threaten. Sue Ellen had made her choice. And for the first time in his life, J.R. Ewing had to live with the consequences of treating someone like property instead of a person. The house felt different without her, emptier, colder. Teresa still cooked. The staff still cleaned. Life went on, but something essential was missing. Not love, maybe. JR had never been good at love, but presence, the knowledge that someone was there, that South Fork was more than just a big house where a man lived alone. Bobby tried to talk to him about it, suggested therapy, suggested actually apologizing, suggested radical thought, treating Sue Ellen like an equal partner if she ever came back. JR dismissed it all. I know how to handle my wife, he'd say. She's not your wife anymore, Bobby would reply, not really. The divorce papers came 3 weeks later, delivered to South Fork by a process server who looked terrified to be there. JR signed for them, didn't open the envelope, just set it on his desk and stared at it like it was a live grenade. Sue Ellen Ewing was filing for divorce, making it official, permanent. His face when he finally opened that envelope was something the cameras caught in close-up, the way his eyes moved across the legal language, the slight tremor in his hands. The realization that this wasn't a bluff. She was serious. She was done. For just a moment, Larry Hagman let every defense drop. Let the audience see the man behind the swagger, the boy who'd grown up desperate for his father's approval, who'd learned that control was the only thing that mattered, who'd built a life on never showing weakness, looking weak anyway, because his wife had left him, and no amount of money or power or scheming could change that simple fact. The door had closed. Sue Ellen had walked into the sunlight, and J.R. Ewing stood alone in the foyer, holding an empty glass, watching everything he'd taken for granted walk away. His face said everything, said more than any speech could convey, said that maybe, just maybe, he'd finally pushed too far, taken too much, assumed too often that people would always be there, no matter how badly he treated them. Sue Ellen had proven him wrong, and in that moment, in that beautiful, terrible moment, J.R. Ewing learned something he'd spent his whole life avoiding. Some things, once broken, don't come back together. Some people, once gone, stay gone. Some doors, once closed, locked from the other side. The suitcase by the door, the click of heels on marble, the sunlight pouring in, the door closing. Goodbye, J.R. His face said everything.